the hard yards of getting things done in government, how we care for the elderly and vulnerable, how to keep the country moving, and how should the government treat farmers in the countryside. None of this is easy. Well, this Sunday morning, we're joined for the first time by the Transport Secretary, Louise Haigh, and by the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey. And also, we'll speak to Chris Philp, the Shadow Home Secretary, later too. Thousands of people in Kyiv have spent the night in shelters after one of the worst nights of Russian strikes in months. 120 missiles and 90 drones have been launched across Ukraine. We'll hear about the terrible impact on the environment of the conflict. Morning, and welcome to my team at the table for the next hour. Dominic Raab, the former Conservative Foreign Secretary, Carla Denyer, co-leader of the Greens and now MP, taking your place in the House of Commons, and Tim Shipman, journalist and chronicler of the Conservatives' Brexit years. Now, let's start, as we always do, with what is making the news this morning, and it's a bit of a mixed bag today. The Mirror goes with the government's £1 billion boost for buses. We'll hear about that from the Transport Secretary later. The Sunday Times claims that Labour is mulling over giving some countries extra money to slow the flow of migrants. The Mail on Sunday slams the number of British delegates that flew to the climate conference COP in Azerbaijan. And we had a flavour of it here last week. The Independent on Sunday leads on the most highfalutin job spat ever, the rivalry between William Hague and Peter Mandelson to become the next Chancellor of Oxford University. Something obviously making huge ructions at breakfast tables around the country. Tim, you've made a huge reputation by chronicling the sort of Tory civil wars, Brexit sagas. Your latest instalment of that is coming out this week. But when you look at this new government, do you think they're finding out it's harder than they thought?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, politics is very complicated, and if there's any lesson from writing thousands of pages about the last 8 years, it's that it's quite difficult, but you can't possibly succeed unless you have a goal and you know where you're going and you know how you're going to get there and you've got the ability to take people with you. And I think what Keir Starmer and some of his colleagues are discovering is that it's quite complicated. They came in with these big 5 missions. They set up boards of ministers to sort out all the big problems. And, you know, people who sit on them say they haven't yet devised really what the top 2 or 3 priorities are for each one. We've got through the budget. They need to spend the next couple of months working out what that is. Otherwise, this is going to be a government led by events rather than getting ahead of them. And
Dominic Raab, when you looked at it, you'd left Parliament before the general election, so you didn't have the sort of disaster of losing your own seat, but it ended pretty badly for your party. Do you have any sympathy for the travails of this new government?
Look, I think as a Democrat and patriot, first and foremost, I want to see Britain do well. Look, it is challenging, but probably the lesson, and this is probably true the other side of the Atlantic as well, is you, in Tim's words, you need a plan. You need to set that out in advance. Actually, the scrutiny of an election, or, for example, in the US, of a convention for the Democrats, is actually quite useful in firming up your plans. That gives you impetus going forward.
And in terms, Carla, of what you've seen since you've been into the House of Commons, you know, we had you on the programme lots of times before when you were hoping to make it there. How do you find it as a new MP, as an opposition party that, you know, instinctively, I know you sort of want to back the left governing party on a few things, but how do you think they're getting on?
I totally recognise that they've been handed a pretty tough opening hand for this government, but I also feel that in several areas they've tied their own hand behind their backs. So on taxation, for example, we Greens were calling for putting the onus on those with the broader shoulders who can more easily afford to pay by introducing a wealth tax. The Labour government completely ruled that out before and since the election. On other aspects of the budget, there's been a lot of giving with one hand and taking with the other in a way that is probably counterproductive, so increasing funding on the NHS, but then policies like the two-child benefit cap and the winter fuel payment means testing will increase costs on the NHS. And on the sewage scandal, an independent commission, which is explicitly banned from considering what I think is probably going to be a big part of the solution, or should be a big part of the solution, which is bringing water companies into public hands.
So Lots to talk about with you three today, and particularly as a former Foreign Secretary, we'll be talking to you about the conflict in Ukraine as well. But one of the issues the government's having to grapple with is transport, because it's not often top of politicians' list. But when trains or planes go wrong, well, then they certainly know about it. Labour's big idea is to set up Great British Rail. They are also spending more cash on the buses, saying that for a long time they've been neglected. They're also freezing fuel duty for drivers. So, what's going on in that brief? Louise Haigh is with us for the first time this morning. It's great to have you with us on a Sunday. Let's start then with the omnibuses, and we'll do trains and planes a bit later on. Now, you're announcing a bit where £1 billion of taxpayers' cash is going in subsidy, but you're taking away the £2 cap on bus fares for passengers. Do you admit just it's logical that's going to make it more expensive for people to get around?
Well, the £2 fare cap was due to finish on the 31st of December. That was the funding settlement I inherited and the budget settlement that was agreed by the previous government. So we stepped in to protect the cap at £3, which means that for rural routes in particular, where the bus fares could have leapt back up to £13 or £14 in some instances, we're keeping it at much lower at £3. But crucially, for fares in cities where previously the fare might have been even less than £2, we're setting it so that operators can't raise fares in more than in line with inflation. So we wouldn't expect all fares to rise to £3. That is a maximum amount. What's really important, though, about this settlement today is that we're improving reliability and frequency of services. You know, for lots of rural areas, they don't have a bus at all, or they don't have one that turns up before 9 a.m. or after 5 p.m. This unprecedented level of funding, particularly into rural areas, will vastly improve services, their reliability and frequency.
But protecting the cap, as you put it, means increasing fares for lots of people. And one of our viewers has been in touch. Kay Carter-Mead says her sister-in-law is a cleaner and a dinner lady. She has to take 3 buses to get to work. It's going to cost her, therefore, an extra £15 a week just to get to work. Where's she meant to find the money on?
Well, I think for people that rely on those kind of numbers of buses, they'd be unlikely to catch 3 single fares. I think it'd be much more economical to buy a kind of weekly card in lots of instances.
Okay, this is a real-life example.
Yeah.
One of our viewers says in their family, somebody's going to have to find an extra £15 a week, and that's money they don't have. So what are they meant to do?
Well, if we hadn't taken action, the fare cap would have been lifted entirely. So we've stepped in with £150 million to protect that level of fare.
Going up for people.
But
so
it shouldn't go up. So depending on where this lady lives, it shouldn't go up to £3. If she's relying on bus services, particularly in urban areas, as I say, they shouldn't be allowed to increase more than inflation. So it shouldn't go up that much. But we are keeping fares at a level that will protect those services in rural areas and, crucially, improving the reliability and frequency. So it means more people can get the bus. It's not an option for too many people, and too many towns and villages are completely cut off from public transport at the moment.
And you are clearly trying to sort of reset this and put a focus on bus services that, you know, more than 3 million people rely on. But there's an important question here. You say you're protecting the cap at £3 for now. What happens at the end of 2025? I mean, can you tell people today that the fares are going to be held at that level for good?
Well, the fare cap is funded until the end of 2025, so we'll use this period to design what comes next. But for the funding settlement that we've agreed with the Treasury is to protect the fare cap until the end of 2025. So we'll design what comes after that. But crucially,
this could go up at the end of 2025.
Well, it's only funded until the end of 2025.
Okay.
But this settlement, crucially, is a record level of investment, particularly for rural areas, places like Devon, Kent, Essex, that got very, very little under the previous government because of the way they designed their funding settlements. They pitted areas against each other. They insisted on competition, and they rewarded those areas who, frankly, invested in the best bid writers rather than based on need. We've designed a formula that allocates the funding based on need, deprivation, and bus mileage in the area, so that we can truly improve bus services for every corner of the country.
You're also taking a different tack on the trains. So you're creating Great British Rail, which you say is nationalising the railways. But if it's not going to actually lower fares, which you're not promising, the companies that are leasing trains will still make profits, as we understand it. So what's the point if fares might still go up and people could still make profits out of the railways?
Well, I was very clear that my immediate priority was improving the reliability and reducing cancellations. We've experienced record delays and cancellations over the last few years on our railways, and that has massively undermined confidence for people to use them, and it's reduced our revenue. So stepping in immediately and resetting industrial relations with the workforce has led to improved passenger confidence, and we've achieved record revenues on some of our lines, particularly LNER, where we've seen reduced cancellations and improved performance. But crucially, the important thing about bringing railways into public ownership is that you combine track and train decisions. Over the last 30 years of privatisation, we've seen the infrastructure operator working in one direction and 14 different train operating companies pulling in a different one, which means the passenger is the last person that the industry focuses on.
But several lines are already in public ownership. I mean, why would a government organisation be any better at running the train lines than other operators? I mean, Northern Rail, for example, is already in public ownership. And everybody watching north of about Watford today knows that the performance of that line is absolutely woeful. So why would Louise Haigh, sitting in Whitehall, be any better at running a train service than people who've been trying their best to do it for years?
Well, first and foremost, it's definitely not going to be me. I've got no experience of running a rail service. It's not going to be me. So this is crucially
Great British. I know that you call yourself the passenger in chief.
Exactly.
But why should people have any faith that an organisation set up by the government, and OK, it'll be an arm's length body, would be better at doing this?
Well, the irony is, actually, over the last few years, particularly since COVID, there's been more operational interference by my department than previously. So we've got the worst of all worlds. We're paying private operators hundreds of millions of pounds in fees, and they're paying that out to dividends to their shareholders, whilst we've got this operational interference from Whitehall officials. What we want to do is set up Great British Railways that will be arm's length, operationally independent from the government, and that's why I'm the passenger in chief and not the fat controller, and they will be running the railways in the interest of the passenger and the taxpayer. At the moment, we've got, as I say, all these competing interests, and it's not even necessarily whether it's about in public or private ownership, but that it is exclusively focused on delivering for the passenger. And by bringing track and train back together, we will ensure that investment in infrastructure has a knock-on effect of delivery for the passenger. We reduce those delays and cancellations, we improve the reliability of the railways, and we ensure the culture of the railways delivers for people.
But you didn't drive a hard bargain when it came to the train drivers' strike. So you got people back to work by offering them pretty chunky inflation-busting pay deals. What strings did you attach to that offer?
Well, firstly, it wasn't inflation busting because we were looking for the last 3 years. It was actually below inflation, and the previous government.
Put it all together, it was a generous deal.
It was a deal over 3 years when inflation at that period had been 12%, and we set it at 4.5%.
But what strings did you attach?
So we had agreements with the drivers' union in particular to take forward agreements around training, and we're going through those agreements at the moment in order to look at moving to a competency-based training, which will improve the settlement for the taxpayer and streamline delivery of particularly new rolling stock when it comes on. There are loads of archaic settlements across the railways that we're finding every day, and we need to work with the unions and with the employers, the operators at the moment, to get through them and to make sure that we have a modern, efficient set of terms and conditions for the railways, because I'm very clear we don't have that at the moment. But I inherited a picture where we had the longest running industrial dispute on our railways, and it was my priority to fix that, to get that back to work, to restore confidence in the railways. And then when we have a less combative environment, then we can work to deliver those workforce reforms. And I'm pleased that we're already starting to see progress on that.
Do it, but they have already had the pay deal. It's good to have you with us for the first time, but we have talked about you and your job before. Many viewers will remember, they might have heard of you for the first time when your views on the ferry company P&O were reported. Do you still think that P&O is a rogue operator?
I think everyone agrees that what P&O Ferries did 2.5 years ago was completely unacceptable. It was illegal.
Call them a rogue operator.
No, I accept that my language, was an unhelpful distraction at the time, particularly at that moment. But what I am pleased that we are able to have done as a government, and what I think was lost in the reporting was that we are legislating to ensure that P&O ferries, illegal sacking of those 800 workers can never happen again.
And would you get on a P&O ferry now? At the time you said you'd boycott it and other people should do so too.
I would like to see P&O ferries implement their seafarers charter and abide by the minimum wage regulations that we are bringing into force on the 1st of December. And then I'd be very happy to get on a P&O ferry.
OK, we're going to talk about another issue now, which is really important to our viewers, which is social care. Now, one of the government's huge problems is that they promised that they would solve how we care for the elderly and vulnerable in England. And for more than a year, Labour has promised in this studio to reveal their plans. But multiple sources have told us in the last couple of weeks there's something of a standoff at the top of government, a genuine impasse, one Whitehall insider told me. The Health Department is keen to crack on with reform, I'm told. The Treasury, understandably perhaps, is worried about the cost. And they're both seeking a political steer from Number 10. And the Chancellor, the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary are due to meet to consider what to do a week tomorrow. This is what Wes Streeting had to say yesterday.
At the same time as we're taking those immediate steps to tackle the crisis, we're building both the 10-year plan for the NHS. We've already launched the biggest national conversation ever. And the Prime Minister and the Chancellor and I are thinking about how to do the same thing with social care. So as well as taking immediate actions, we make the right long-term decisions.
And we know from you there are so many thousands of families caught up in this, a real dilemma. Here's just one example of why it matters. Deborah Crisp has been in touch to explain why she thinks the system has to change.
3 years ago, my 98-year-old mother had to go into a care home due to dementia and other health issues. It's a wonderful care home. She's really, really happy there. She funded it via the sale of her retirement flat, just under £200,000. And now that money has gone, the local authorities say they cannot fund her to stay where she is and she will need to be moved somewhere else. And we feel that due to her multiple health issues, it will be catastrophic for her to be moved elsewhere, and we really fear for her safety.
Now, Louise Haigh, you were chair of the parliamentary group on social care, so I know it's not your job now, but you are familiar with this issue. Do you accept that the longer the government takes to make its mind up, the worse this situation gets for families, not just like Deborah's, but people stuck in here and people stuck in hospital?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really urgent that we fix this issue, and countless of your viewers will have been in exactly the same situation that Deborah finds herself in now. You know, watching that was exactly the situation my grandma was in till she died. It's you know, for too long we've let this problem fester, and that's why it was really important that we stepped in to establish the fair pay agreement in legislation. That was actually one of the really key things that my all-party group looked at with the previous social care minister, Gillian Keegan, when she was still in Parliament.
But this is about the longer-term overhaul. Now, your manifesto said that there would be plans for a national care service. Wes Streeting, as Shadow Health Secretary 18 months ago, sat in that chair and said that the plan would come. We haven't seen the plan. There is no suggestion that it is imminent. We know there's a meeting shortly between three people at the top of government. I suppose the question many people wonder is how can you convince them you really are taking this seriously when there's no sign of your long-term plan?
Well, just a few, 4 months into government, Wes Streeting has set out the 10-year plan for the NHS, and crucially, a big part of that reform is to move to prevention and to community care. Now, that community care element will start to ease pressures on social care. In the budget, there was £600 million allocated through local authorities for social care.
Making care homes pay national insurance, that's not even going to touch the sides. Some providers told me this week they might not even be able to, they might have to close down because of that extra cost.
Well, and that kind of funding will be set out as we develop through the budget and through the allocations. But the fair pay agreement, I can't stress how important that will be, because there were 150,000 vacancies in the care sector when we entered government, and that is precisely because there aren't the progression opportunities in the care sector. Too many care workers aren't paid properly, despite it being a really important and in a lot of cases a really medicalised, highly skilled job. They're paid not far off minimum wage. So we need to make sure we are tackling those long-term issues in the workforce with progression progression opportunities properly paid and properly negotiated on a collective basis.
And do you want to involve the other parties in putting together a solution here?
I think Wes Streeting was on your programme just a few weeks ago and said exactly that. I think it's really important that we build that long-term consensus because this problem has plagued our politics for too long.
OK, well, as if by magic, we're about to talk to one of them. But Louise Haigh, it's great to have you with us in the studio for the first time on a Sunday. Thank you for your time. Well, the pressure is certainly on the government to make its mind up, not least from the Liberal Democrats, who have made sorting out social care in England one of their very biggest priorities. Their leader, Sir Ed Davey, has made no bones about his very personal reasons for pursuing the subject. As a teenager, he cared at home for his mother, and now he is a carer for his disabled teenage son, John. I suspect you well remember this video that the party released during the election campaign, which gave us a glimpse of their life at home, a different environment to how we normally see political leaders in Westminster and in studios like this. Well, Sir Ed is with us this morning. Welcome to you. It's good to have you with us on a Sunday again. Now, we've reported this week the government seems to be at an impasse over what to do. We know that they're considering whether to have a cross-party royal commission, which could take several years, but might take the politics out of this issue, or whether there should be an independent government-backed review. Do you have a preference between those two mechanisms, or actually, some people in the sector say, you know what the problems are, there've been a million reviews, just get on with it?
Yeah, politicians have been failing on this for far too long. They've come on your programme and others and bandied it around and not really get over what you got over today, that there are millions of people suffering, families being hit financially, people in misery and pain, and we have got to tackle this. And I think it's a real test for the new government. We're willing, in the Liberal Democrats, to play a constructive part. You're right, we have put this right at the front of our priorities. I think the government does need to talk cross-party. We're willing and ready to go into those negotiations. We said that at the general election. But I do think there are things they need to do straight away that are actually obvious. Louise Haigh just then was talking about part of them, which is sorting out the vacancies, because whatever the long-term solution is, we're going to need more carers. I think they need to be more ambitious about that. We talked about a minimum wage for carers, for example. We need to professionalise this and give it a real status, because it is so critical. So there are things that need to do right up front now, but let's get round the table and let all parties come and talk.
And would it make a difference to you whether it did have the badge of being a royal commission or whether it was an independent review? And I wonder, have you had a call yet from Wes Streeting saying, let's get round the table?
No, we haven't had a call, Laura, but the cross-party talks could take many forms. My only concern about a royal commission, and we would back it, but we need the immediate measures first, and it mustn't be an excuse for long grassing this. It needs to happen urgently. Even the long-term reforms could happen more quickly than sometimes a royal commission does. For this reason, there's immediate things to be done, I think, that are no-brainers, but it's still urgent to fix it. And you can't have a 10-year plan for the NHS unless you've got a real serious plan for social care. The
reality is, though, and politicians over generations have shied away often because the cost of a better social care system in England would be billions and billions and billions of pounds. And, even in Scotland this week, where they were trying to introduce a national care service, those plans have been shelved again. This is a huge and expensive thing to do. And you've welcomed the extra money for health and social care the government as promised in the budget, but you've criticised the tax rises that they're using to pay for it. Aren't you being a bit hypocritical? Because you're saying you want it all, but you don't want to pay for it.
No, I think in the general election, you're aware, we had a fully funded health and social care investment, and we had taxes, not the taxes the government have put forward. And one of my concerns about the way they're proposing to pay for this through employers' national insurance contributions is going to make the problem in the NHS worse, because GPs and community pharmacists are going to have to pay this, and they're already totally stretched, but also care providers, care homes, domiciliary care agencies are going to pay it unless the government changes their minds.
But the tax rises that you said you would bring in the election came up to about 8 billion. The government's put in more than 20 billion into the NHS. So there's a big hole there that has to be filled somehow.
Well, I think there are two or three things I'd say on this. First of all, the costs of inaction are huge. Already, your viewers and taxpayers are paying billions of pounds every year because the government isn't fixing it. Inaction is incredibly expensive. And I think
But
that's
on the
really
specific,
important.
You were saying, well, they shouldn't raise taxes in that way, but your tax rises that you set out would only raise 8 billion, whereas the government's putting in more than 20 billion to the NHS. So how would you fill that hole?
Well, let me take two more things on that, as well as the expense of inaction. First of all, in our plans at the election, we talked about the huge savings that would come to the NHS, but didn't put them in our programme. And what I would say to Wes Streeting and other ministers, look at the massive savings that would come to the NHS. Take the orthodoxy of the Treasury on. The benefits for the NHS of tackling social care are huge. People not in hospital for so long, which is expensive and bad for them. People having to return to hospital because the care hasn't been sorted out. These are big costs and they're not factored in. So first of all, I put that on the table. Secondly, I think when they start having to refund to the public sector, be it the NHS or GPs or community pharmacists or care providers, for the national insurance they've raised on it, their net revenue they've raised will be much, much less. So I think when you add all this, the costs of inaction, which are huge, the savings you can make from the NHS and sort of the taxes that we would bring to the table, like, for example, a tax on online gambling.
And you think that could make up the difference? It's a difference of, more than £10 million?
Well, I think if you look at this, probably absolutely we do. And, we would come as constructive as possible to these cross-party talks. We've been championing them. We bring our tax proposals and listen to others in a very open way.
But you're still waiting by the phone?
I've not been called yet, Laura.
I want to talk about also what's a very emotive issue, but it's very much in people's minds at the moment, the concept of assisted dying. The week after next, MPs will have a vote on this. Now, your view is that we shouldn't move forward with this proposal as a country. But it's interesting because the Lib Dem party, as a group, has voted for this as a party policy to support assisted dying. Do you find it sort of uncomfortable, perhaps, to break with your party on this? Because the vote will be a free vote. Party politics aren't meant to be involved. But your party has taken a clear position on it previously.
Well, first of all, I've made it always clear this is my personal position. It's a position I've held for many, many years. And if you look at the policy that we passed, we made it clear that it was an issue of conscience and there would be a free vote for all Liberal Democrat MPs. So what I'm doing is in line with that motion. But I feel strongly about this, and I hope we can have longer to debate this in Parliament, because I have a number of concerns. One of the big concerns is the psychological pressure on people who are maybe terminally ill or disabled or elderly, that they're a burden on others. Not the other people are putting the pressure on them, but they're putting it on themselves. And if we go down this route, I think that will be unbearable for some, and people will opt for this when they don't really want to. They're just doing it from a selfless point of view. And, my experience looking after my mum when I was a teenager, and I used to do the palliative care. I'd provide morphine to her. I'd put pads on her so she'd give herself electric shocks to distract her from the actual pain of her bone cancer. My experience of that and my reflection on that has been that we could do so much more on palliative care by getting that right. And I think if we got that right, got the NHS right, got the care systems right that we've been talking about, I think many of the people who are worried about this would feel relieved, and I think it would take the sting out of this issue.
And there are many facets to it. It's a sensitive and a really important issue that will no doubt be talked about a lot in the next few weeks. Just finally, I'd like to ask you about something else. The Archbishop of Canterbury resigned this week after criticisms over how he'd handled allegations of abuse in the church. That's led to a fresh focus on the conduct of your leader in Wales, Jane Dodds. Now, an official report in 2021 found that when she was working for the church in child protection, that she had made a grave error by not pursuing a meeting to discuss a particular sexual abuse case. She's accepted that there were shortcomings in what she did. Are you happy with her explanation of events, and do you have confidence in her?
Well, I think this whole issue around the Church of England is hugely serious, and we have to take it seriously. I welcome the resignation of the Archbishop. I've spoken to Jane about this. She has apologised, and she has had an incredibly career looking after children, but I've made it clear to her I think she needs to think about her responsibility on this.
So should she think about her position?
I think
Sounds like you're hinting at that.
I think she does need to reflect on this very carefully. I accept that she has apologised, but this is such a serious issue. So I think she does need to think about what else she may need to do.
That sounds like code for she should resign.
I want Jane to reflect on this. I have spoken to her. I've made my feelings really clear to her about what I think she should do, and I think she's reflecting. I hope she does.
OK, Sir Ed, thank you very much. It's always great to have you with us on a Sunday and speaking about an issue that you've campaigned so hard on. Thank you very much indeed for being here. Now, remember, as ever, we want to know what you think. You can send us an email, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or if you're a social media kind of person, you can use the hashtag #BBC. It is all there on the screen for you now, including our WhatsApp number. And we will try and share some of your comments at the end of the programme, or indeed in our newsletter on Thursday. Let's then get back to the panel. Now, social care. Carla, have the Greens been approached? Because the Lib Dems who've campaigned on this say they haven't been approached on social care. Have you heard anything from the government?
Not that I'm aware of. Our lead on health and social care is my co-leader, Adrian, rather than myself. But as far as I know, no, they haven't been in touch yet.
And Dominic, why is it so difficult? Because the Conservatives tried umpteen times to reform social care and then either ditched the plans, changed the plans, realised they'd be unpopular. Is that what it's about? It's just too difficult?
Do you know, I actually think there's a widespread cross-party agreement that this must be done. One of the big challenges is that it requires upfront investment to yield a longer-term gain, not just in social care, but actually savings for the NHS. And that is the conundrum that governments always grapple with. Health secretaries want to do it. Chancellors tend to be a bit more reticent. And that's why, ultimately, it will need Keir Starmer to drive that forward.
Do you think that there is merit, though, in the idea of working cross-party? Because also, we've heard that before, because what happens is parties get together, they get round the table, and then when the rubber hits the road, you might be getting close to, I don't know, an election, and then no party wants to be the one that says, OK, that means a penny or two on your income tax.
There's always a risk of that, and the idea that something so contentious would be immune from the accountability and the party politics, I think is fanciful. On the other hand, I think if any government actually came forward and said, we're going to do this, it also puts the other parties who've talked a good game in a tight spot. But as ever, and it comes back to the point we were discussing earlier in the show, it needs vision, leadership, plan, and you've just got to grapple with it and take it forward.
Tim, what are the politics of this right now, do you think, at the top of the government?
Well, look, I think, as ever, as Dominic says, there's a row between the Department of Health and the Treasury, and the Treasury is not very good at doing dynamic modelling that looks forward and says, well, if we do this now, we might get a gain down the line. But I think, you know, I slightly disagree with Dom in terms of the party politics. I think this needs to be taken out, at least immediately out of party politics. I mean, you look at what happened in the past. In the last Labour government, Andy Burnham had a plan. The Tories called it a death tax. In the 2017 general election, Theresa May had a plan. Labour called it a dementia tax. My new book has the row between Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak over this. Johnson wanted to do it, Sunak wouldn't pay for it. So some kind of royal commission, as long as it's time limited and quick and everybody buys into it, if they all buy in, they can't then just sort of renege and run away. But if you just sit politicians around a table, they're going to find a way of briefing against the others.
Surely not. Carla?
And I think it's about being brave. You know, I credit where it's due, and us Greens have always been clear that we will work with the Labour government where we agree. I think the increase in funding for the NHS that was announced in the budget was really positive. But we need that corresponding investment in social care, because otherwise, as Ed Davey said, you have the problem of people being stuck in hospital longer than they need to be, which is bad for their health and bad for the NHS's budget. So those two, the health investment and the social care investment, need to go hand in hand. That was what was in our manifesto. Labour's announcement on funding for the NHS was actually pretty close to what we were saying. I was surprised how high it was. But we need that matching social care investment. And Dominic, would you say to your colleagues now, under the Conservative Party, under new management, would you tell them actually be the bigger person, get involved in this, back what the government might look at? Yeah, I mean, you can't give a blank cheque, and the devil will always be in the detail. And there's some really difficult issues about the balance between user pays and taxpayer underwriting the long-term dementia risk. But I think, you know, the proposals that have come forward from the Blair years through to the Sunak years have always looked broadly in the right place. At some point, you've got to drive it forward and grapple with it. Now, in terms of what's happening now in the world, you know, we've seen terrible attacks in Ukraine again overnight. We heard President Zelensky yesterday say he actually thought under President Trump the war could come to an end. What do you think is going on, you know, with your hat as a former Foreign Secretary?
Well, we're over 2 years into this awful conflict. I think there is close to deadlock on the battlefield strategically, and I think there's a lot of strategic ambiguity in terms of the diplomatic support, both on the European side, divisions as to how much a deal should be done, certainly in terms of donor fatigue, and of course people are waiting to see what a new President Trump will do about it.
And you worked with the first Trump administration. I think we've got some pictures actually of you with the President, and Mike Pompeo would have been your opposite number, I believe, during that era. There are so many different conflicting signals that come out, not just from him, but from his appointees, the people around him. What's your instinct about the kind of course that they really want to chart here?
Well, it's difficult. They want to see more burden sharing from Europeans. They think that they shouldn't be taking a blank cheque for the umbrella of military security in Europe, when they also want to be focusing on China and the challenges in Asia. On the other hand, they'll be acutely aware, Mike Pompeo was very strong on this under the previous administration, about the moral hazard of letting Putin win. And I think the new president will be very conscious of those two dilemmas and how to reconcile them.
Tim, what's your sense of where this might go? I mean, all journalists, everybody has been, generating huge amounts of news and commentary, trying to look for clues about where it might go next. But what's your sense? Well,
I was in Washington a couple of weeks ago, just the week before the US election, and I met there with a lot of diplomats, including people who sort of represent Zelensky in Washington. I was pleasantly surprised. The people I was talking to there seemed to think that in the conversation Trump had personally had with Zelensky, he sounded a lot more sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause than is widely believed, but that he's got to keep his party happy and put Vladimir Putin on the spot. Clearly, he plans to pick up the phone to Putin and try and do a deal. Zelensky's making noises that, as long as it's fair, would be acceptable. And I think we don't yet know exactly what that administration is going to do, but I think Trump is not quite as against Kyiv as has been widely perceived. And Carla, what do you make of the UK's role here? Because the political support in this country has been pretty rock solid for President Zelensky, but if America takes a different tack, that gets awkward, doesn't it?
It does, and I think a lot of people are very worried about what President-elect Trump means for the world, including for Ukraine. And I think this is a time when we need to really think carefully about where our values overlap, and I think it's a time to build stronger relationships with Europe.
Now, Dominic, one of the aspects of all of this is how long Russia can sustain the war, what's going on in the Russian economy. Now, as a former cabinet minister, you're now involved in the World Gold Council, and there's a really interesting set of findings about how some of Putin's cronies are paying their way. Tell us about the findings.
Well, I've been looking at the artisanal gold sector, about 20% of gold production globally. Poor, enterprising, very vulnerable miners around the world, preyed on, pillaged, plundered by all sorts of nefarious groups from Islamic State and the Sahel. But most prolific is the Wagner Group. And since the invasion of Iraq, not only have they murdered, tortured, subjected to forced labour, huge number of these artisanal miners bad on moral grounds, but that has rendered something like $2.5 billion worth of illicit profits, all going back into the war machine, tilting the balance on the battlefields of Ukraine. And I think the question is not just the humanitarian plight of these artisanal miners, as compelling as that is, but the material security threat that allowing these illicit flows to continue represents.
So Wagner Group, which is a really important part of the Russian war machine, is being funded by illicit gold mining right around the world.
Absolutely, and we've known about this. They've been active in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Libya, but the scale of it is unprecedented. And again, if you think about donor fatigue, and we've talked about whether a new Trump administration wants to stump up cash, one of the things we ought to be doing is making sure, through secondary sanctions, through proper checks in terms of the laundering of this money, that they're not being able to launder billions of dollars from these poor communities, robbing the nations blind, and then putting it back into the war machine in Ukraine.
But some of our viewers might say that when you were a Conservative minister, actually there weren't enough tough sanctions on Russia, and also the Conservative Party over the years did take some money from Russian donors. So is the UK somehow also being complicit in not doing enough here?
Yeah, I think actually the UK has very proudly been at the forefront of applying sanctions, but I think there has been a gap, a certain porous element to this gold laundering. that has gone on. And we, you know, I make absolutely no apologies saying, look, as the scale of that becomes clearer, as the war in Ukraine hangs in the balance, we absolutely must make sure that back door is locked.
And Carla, just at the end of the programme, we're going to talk a bit about what's been happening with COP, because the environmental side of what's happening in the war in Ukraine is also enormous. But I just wonder what you made of what Dominic's just told us about there.
Well, I think, Laura, you were right to highlight the importance of sanctions in this. I think there is arguably more that the UK and EU could be doing on that. I think this story also highlights that environmental degradation, including breaking environmental laws, human rights abuses and corruption so often go hand in hand. We see that with the illegal drug trade, with tobacco, as well as with gold. And I think, and in much of the global south, in fact, our sister parties, Green parties in places like Africa, the Green Party is often seen as the anti-corruption party as well because of how much they're entangled. I think that's a sign of how important it is to tackle them together.
Follow the money. We'll be back with the three of you at the end of the programme. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Kemi Badenoch, the brand new Conservative leader, was with us. She wants to win back your support. She's having a good look under the bonnet of what went wrong for the Conservative Party in the election. And the Shadow Home Secretary is a new member of her top team, Chris Philp. Welcome. It's good to have you with us on a Sunday again. Now, let's talk about your brief, because it's interesting. You were in the Home Office for a while before when you were in government, and now you're the Shadow Home Secretary. But when you left office in July, one poll showed more than 70% of the public thought the Tories had handled crime badly. So how do you propose to win back the public's trust?
Well, I think first of all, it's worth remembering that when we left office, we had record ever numbers of police officers and crime overall had been consistently falling. And we should, I think, remind ourselves and everybody else about that. But I think we clearly need to go further. What we introduced in office was this concept: the police should always, not sometimes, but always investigate every single crime where there is a line of inquiry. So we need to make sure the new government actually hold the police to account for delivering that. We got that agreement in office. It now needs to be delivered. There are also enormous advances that can be made using technology, things like artificial intelligence, things like autonomous drones, things like live facial recognition, which will enable the police to catch a lot more criminals. So I'd like to see that being done as well.
But in terms of your record, I mean, you mentioned there you had a record number of police officers. That was true, but only after they had fallen. That was something that you sort of rectified in office, and you presided over a fall before that. And
although, to be clear, the finishing point was still higher than in 2010. Yeah, and I can only speak for my time in office, and as police minister, I delivered record police numbers.
But when it comes also to to the levels of crime, the rate of reported crimes being solved had fallen for a decade. And very clearly, from our inbox, from our viewers, and from a lot of public polling, many of the public thought you'd done a bad job on crime and the country had become less safe. So how do you get people's trust back beyond talking about, you know, the use of more technology? Because didn't something more fundamental get broken here, people's trust in you?
Well, just to, again, overall crime levels did fall very considerably. But you're right, not enough crimes were being solved. So that's why I challenged the police, or asked the police, required the police a few months ago to give a commitment to always, not sometimes, but always investigate all crimes where there are reasonable lines of inquiry. And we started seeing those figures beginning to turn. And if the new government continue with that policy, then I think we'll see the trend improve. But I'll be holding them to account to make sure they continue with those policies. And you mentioned technology sort of slightly dismissively, but actually technology can help the police catch a lot more criminals. We've seen it in Croydon Town Centre, my own borough, where live facial recognition has caught 200 criminals, including a man wanted for a double rape, in recent months. Those are 200 criminals who would not otherwise have been caught.
I just wonder, though, what you think it is went wrong, that sort of contract between the public and its government. People, polling suggests, we know that from the election result, we know it from our inbox. Ask you again, what do you think went wrong between people's trust in you to keep them safe and what the government had been doing?
Well, I think there was a time when the police became a bit distracted from some of the basic activities they should focus on. And first and foremost, the police are there to catch criminals. And what I wanted to do when I was police minister, so I started a couple of years ago, is to get the police to really get back to basics, to focus on the fundamentals, having zero tolerance for crime, including things like antisocial behaviour, taking nitrous oxide, crime, criminal damage, those kind of lower level crimes, because if you allow those to happen, it creates an environment where more serious crime can take
But
place.
you say they'd been distracted. I mean, the police, why do you think they were distracted? Because the police were, doing the bidding with operational independence, but the police are operating in an environment where there were Conservative governments. What were they distracted
Well, look, I can
by?
only speak for my own time as police minister in the last 2 years.
Well, you're also speaking as a Conservative rather than, you can't pick and choose, just say, I'm only going to talk about those 2 years when I was doing that particular job.
The 2 years when I was doing that job, I delivered record police numbers and asked the police to focus relentlessly on catching criminals of all kinds, serious and less serious together.
So all your predecessors got it wrong then?
No, I didn't say that. That is the right approach, and it will mean more criminals get caught. It'll mean the public gets safer. But in fairness to my various predecessors, under successive Conservative Home Secretaries, crime, measured by the crime survey, did consistently fall.
But your leader, when she was with us a couple of weeks ago, and in her speeches and when she was running for leader, she did say you have to work out what went wrong. So I wonder what you think went wrong. Rather than talking about when you were there for 2 years and you say lots of good things happen, what do you think went wrong? What did Conservative Home Secretaries get wrong during their time in office?
So the one thing that I challenged the police with, because I think it needed to improve, was the fact that not enough crimes were being solved. It was as simple as that, right? Not enough crimes were being solved, and I set in place a plan to fix that.
Our viewers will have seen the dispute in the last few days between the Telegraph journalist Alison Pearson and Essex Police about a tweet. Now, we are not going to resolve that argument here, but it has put a focus on what are called non-crime hate incidents. Now, in normal plain speak, that's an abusive act that doesn't necessarily meet a threshold for prosecution. But your party brought in the concept of recording these incidents. Was that a mistake?
Well, one of the things I did in government just recently was actually significantly tighten the thresholds for these non-crime hate incidents, because I was very concerned about them. And I'm rather concerned to see that Yvette Cooper, the new Home Secretary, is now looking at undoing the changes that I made as Police Minister just a few months ago.
But was it a mistake to bring in this concept at all? If, as you say, you wanted more crimes to be solved, why introduce a concept where the police spend time investigating and looking at things that aren't a crime?
Well, that is partly what I was referring to a minute or two ago when I said the police had been distracted. So we've
was
seen
it a
cases.
Mistake?
I think it was a mistake, yes, for the police to look at things like there's a different journalist, a different Telegraph journalist who was spoken to by the police about commenting on trans issues. We've seen 9-year-olds in schools being spoken to, and yes, that was wrong. It should not have happened. But that was a mistake. The police shouldn't have done it.
But was it a mistake to introduce this concept? It was a concept introduced and legislated for by your Conservative government. Was it a mistake to introduce this idea at all?
Yeah, so I think it needs to be significantly recalibrated. So I think the police should concentrate on investigating crimes. The only time I think it's justified to look at behaviour that falls below the criminal threshold is where there is a real and immediate danger of criminality subsequently occurring. Now, that is a very high threshold.
So what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean if someone's behaving in a way that suggests they might be about to commit a crime, I think that is something the police should pay attention to. But things like a Telegraph journalist, a different journalist, not Alison Pearson, a different one, commenting on trans issues, for example, or 9-year-olds in playgrounds, both of whom have been caught by this non-crime hate incident net. That is wrong, and the rules, I think, should be changed. Now, I started to change them a few months ago to lift those thresholds. I'm very concerned that Yvette Cooper may be planning to scrap the changes that I introduced.
But here you were speaking in the Commons in February. You said, where things do not meet the criminal threshold but might still be useful in pursuing a criminal investigation later, they will still be recorded. Yeah. Now, that's a bit different to what you're saying today.
I don't think it is. No, I don't think it is.
Well, forgive me. You just said it should only be used when a crime might be about to be committed.
And that's what I meant by my words in February. That is what I meant in February.
So can you give us an example of that, just so people can understand what you mean? When should the police record this kind of non-crime hate-related incident? Because we want to get away from the jargon. Yeah. Exactly what do you mean about what is a good use of police time when it's not a crime?
Well, I think if somebody is, for example, appears to be about to threaten violence, or they're expressing, views that are, exceptionally either racist or misogynistic, that might suggest that could lead very imminently to a crime being committed, then I think we would want the police to keep an eye on that. But the majority, probably 90%, of these non-crime hate incidents that are being looked at don't meet that much
90%.
higher. Well, I'm speculating, but a large proportion. I've given you some examples already. The police should not be policing free speech. The police should not be policing thought. They should be concentrating on actual crime or behaviour that is just below the criminal threshold and might realistically and imminently lead to a crime. We want them to focus on those crimes, as I was saying earlier, not be policing thought.
And just briefly, we've talked a lot about social care this morning. To your knowledge, have the Conservatives been approached by the government in a cross-party way to start talking about social care in England?
Not to my knowledge personally, but I'm the Shadow Home Secretary, not the Shadow Health Secretary. Look, of course, we'll always try and be constructive on issues of national importance like this. We did have a plan based on the Dilnot report. And in fact, we were about to start piloting a new approach that would have capped care costs for families, but Labour have unfortunately scrapped that pilot. Labour had in the past, as I think you said, talked about a national care plan or national care service. Apparently that's now disappeared, and the Labour Party now appear to have no plan whatsoever. And given they've had some time in opposition to develop a plan, that is very, very disappointing. And in fact, all they've done really is slap this national insurance tax on the care sector, which will make it even more difficult for the care sector to operate. OK,
well, we will see what happens. Chris Philp, Shadow Home Secretary, it's great to have you with us in the studio in your new job. I'm sure we'll see you again soon. Thanks so much indeed. Now then, we've talked about Ukraine already today, more strikes overnight in the capital, and you might have been deafened by all the megaphone diplomacy on what's going on. Yesterday, President Zelensky said he thought the war would end. Now, President Trump is heading back to the White House, but the violence goes on. We can show you some pictures. Here are people last night seeking safety in the subway in Kyiv, heading to the underground to shelter from one of the worst nights of Russian strikes this autumn. But the conflict has been devastating, not just in terms of the loss of life, but also on the environment. The country is now marked with landmines, pollution and destruction. But despite the war, the Environment Minister in Ukraine, Svitlana Hrynchuk, is heading to the COP climate talks in Baku, where Ukraine wants to show the world that despite the challenges it faces, it's still trying to meet its climate commitments.
COP29 is of real strategic importance for Ukraine. We want to prevent Russia from including the occupied territories in its reports. Since 2014, Russia has been including the territories of Crimea, Donetsk and Luhansk regions in its reports submitted to the UN, and for us it is unacceptable. Russia will also use this platform to constantly push for the legalization of their occupation policy.
Do you think even your close allies really grasp the extent of the damage to the environment the war has caused?
One of our main tasks at COP is to show the entire world the environmental consequences of Russia's war against Ukraine. This includes landmines, burnt forests, significant water and air pollution, and huge loss of animal and marine life. We must understand that a quarter of Ukraine's lands and forests are mined, and it will take us decades to demine those territories. We've been working on demining them actively. We are grateful to all our partners who join us in our efforts. Domestic companies are coming up with innovations in creating demining machines and making new technologies to help the process.
Everyone's heard of the risks to nuclear facilities because of the war, particularly about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. What's going on there and how much of a risk is there from Russia to facilities like that?
The situation at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is like a bomb that can explode at any time, because the plant is occupied and both Russian troops and Russian military equipment are there. And frankly, a facility of this level in the hands of terrorists is always a threat to Ukraine, to the countries around us and to the whole world. It is a huge nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe. Moreover, every day we face the threat of a disruption in power supply to the plant, because the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is powered by the Ukrainian energy system, including its cooling system. And even though the plant is not producing electricity now, it must receive electricity from the Ukrainian system to maintain its safety.
And last, Minister, how worried is your government about the election of the new president in America? What do you need to hear from the Trump administration on its way back to power?
I think American society is definitely not divided into those who support or oppose Russia's war in Ukraine. American people have supported us from the very beginning, when Russia first invaded, back in 2014, and throughout the full-scale invasion. And regardless of whether a representative of the Democrats or the Republicans was the president, we have always felt significant support from the United States. I'm sure that the US will continue to be our partner on key issues such as the defense of our country and the protection of its sovereignty and resources, including our environment. Because for the United States, as well as for Ukraine and for the whole civilized world, the provision of a dignified life and the protection of human rights remain fundamental principles.
Minister, great to talk to you from Kyiv. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, it's interesting that Ukrainian minister is going off to COP. Keir Starmer, of course, Carla, went to COP. But there has been this year, you know, a lot of allegations, accusations that COP actually is a bit of a cop-out, not least because the host has sort of defended oil and gas. I mean, as a Green Party leader, have you still got faith in that process?
I've always had concerns about COP. It's really important we take part, especially because it is the opportunity for smaller countries, island nations, countries in the global south who don't have obviously nearly as much power as those in the G20 to negotiate on an equal footing, or supposedly equal footing. So it's really important that we support the COP process. However, that doesn't mean we can't be honest about the fact that it needs to be sharpened up. So there have been achievements, but those have been in negotiating pledges. And as that open letter that came out this week says, it really needs to refocus now onto action. And I think the fossil fuel lobbyists need to be shut out of the process.
Really? I mean, isn't that though realistic that you actually have to have the industry there if they're to find solutions? Because many of the big companies that are producing oil and gas are also moving massively into renewable energy. So is shutting anybody out of any discussion a good plan?
When the fossil fuel lobbyists outnumber those from many of the countries at the sharp end of the climate crisis, you have to wonder what perverting effect that has on the outcomes of the negotiations. We've had COP after COP that has made variously promising and less promising sounding pledges. The problem is the action actually following from that. And I welcome the fact that Keir Starmer's attending, even though many other leaders aren't. But we need to see the UK lead on both domestic and international solutions.
And why does it seem not to have the political cachet that it once did? I mean, not that long ago, Boris Johnson was hosting COP in Glasgow. It was a huge priority for the former Conservative government. As a mechanism, it seems to have lost its sort of political cachet.
Yeah, and I think you're in a world where there's a lot of problems, and economically people are looking for a way of keeping the lights on that doesn't involve necessarily moving to renewables immediately. Britain's a little bit out on a limb. I mean, Starmer was almost alone of major Western leaders actually attending COP, and I think the government's got a bit of a balancing act here. All the polls suggest the British public cares about the environment, it cares about net zero, but if the US election tells us anything, it's that they also care more about their own personal finances, and Labour has to balance what it needs to do on the environment with, you know, how much it's going to end up costing the public.
But Dominic, there are a lot of Conservatives who now say that you should edge away from net zero. The new leader, Kemi Badenoch, seems to be suggesting actually quite a different approach to previously. But would you warn your colleagues against moving too far away from it, or where do you think the balance is?
I think actually when you look at one of the things that's borne out is when you look at what Boris Johnson and Alex Sharma did with our COP, actually, huge amount of work went into it. Of course, you can't let the best be the enemy of the good. I think the critical thing is to try and have some kind of consistency over a long-term plan. It needs to be sustainable. The points that Tim is making about what voters will actually be willing to bear, it's got to be taken seriously. But certainly trying to capture that win-win of the economic advantages of a sustainable approach, coupled with the sacrifices that will need to be made now, actually really important.
OK, Carla, finally.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on Tim's framing of the affordability. That is quite a misleading comment to make, because climate change is costing the world $16 million per hour. By 2100, it'll cost 7.4% of our GDP if we don't act on climate change, which is a hell of a lot more than the cost of acting. So it's a money-saving measure the faster we go on
It may be in the long run, but in the meantime, it may put people's bills up, and that's a political problem.
What is the purpose of a government if not to make long-term decisions for the well-being of our country?
OK, well, long-term decisions are often the hardest ones to make, whether it's on the environment or social care, as we've been talking about this morning, but it's been great to have all of you with us this morning. Thank you for getting in touch. You've been busy. Sean says People would be willing to pay more tax if it went into a social care pot and was only used for that purpose. But Ian is tired of waiting. He says, talk, talk, talk. That's all we get. We need action now, not more royal commissions. Kicking the can has to stop. But Tony says it took the Conservatives 14 years to get nowhere with social care. Well, we like hearing what you have to say and your clear opinions. Thank you so much to all my guests today, and of course most for you for watching on a week when we've talked about the hard yards of governing. So Keir Starmer is off again on international business to the G20 summit in Brazil. And clearly at this moment in the world, conversations about foreign policy are at the top of the list. But that doesn't make the domestic dilemmas disappear. You can catch up with today's programme on iPlayer and on BBC Sounds now too. Later, I'll be on Newscast with Paddy O'Connell, of course. And I'll look forward very much to seeing you same time, same place next week.